I almost let that man die, until he whispered the secret I'd kept hidden for 40 years. It was the end of the shift. The corridors were already drained of color. Just the greenish glow of the dirty lamp and the smell of chloroform mixed with dried blood. My knees ached, and my eyes were blurry from stitching up torn flesh. That's when the lieutenant walked past me and said, "That one's not on the list. Leave it to him." The stretcher was lying near the disposal door. The body was barely breathing. His face was covered in dirt, his uniform unrecognizable, and a deep wound in his neck. The kind of case we learn to forget. I approached instinctively just to see if there was a sign. And there was. A tiny one, on his lips. He moved slightly, and then he spoke. Just one sentence, short, warm, direct. The kind of thing that reaches through time and into the back of your neck. He whispered what I'd kept hidden for 40 years. A secret that no one, absolutely no one, could ever know. And in that moment, between duty and vertigo, I wasn't a nurse. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't anything. I just stood there, facing what came back to charge me. My name is Althea Jean Morris. I have 93 years. And right now, I'm sitting near the old piano here in the Lutheran shelter where I live, deep in Missouri. The clock stopped days ago, and the wall calendar still shows the summer of 1971. My fingers ache when it's cold, and my knees can no longer bear the weight of the past. But it's memory that I fear most. For decades, I've avoided telling this story. I wrote letters and tore them up, tried to pray and kept quiet. Today, perhaps because I dreamed about him again, I decided to speak, to tell what happened, what I never told my sister, or the pastor, or God. It's not easy to remember, but it's harder to hide. If you're listening now, tell me where you are. I want to know how far this secret will go. I had 22 years when I landed in Naples, in Italy. The war had already devoured half the world, and I was sent to A Amputee Center, improvised in a bombed-out former convent. The wing where I was still had broken stained-glass windows, and the smell of burning incense in the corners. I was one of the only black nurses on the base, and I had to learn quickly to be invisible when needed, and unwavering when someone fell into my arms. It was hard work, crushed limbs, screams that echoed in the night, men begging me to lie and say they would walk again. We learned to harden our faces, but never our hearts. I carried with me a silver brooch my mother gave me, and a notebook, where I wrote down the names that weren't on any official records, just so no one would be forgotten. But he didn't even seem to have a name. Sometimes I think silence has a sound, a different sound, deep, almost like a choked prayer. I remember the first time I felt it. It wasn't with the death of a patient, nor when I learned my father had left without saying goodbye. It was that night in the backyard, among boxes of supplies and rusty chairs no one used anymore. The amputee center in Naples was overcrowded, and gurneys had already filled even the hallways of the bathing ward. We were at the height of evacuations, and everything smelled of haste, mold, and desperation, muffled by shouted orders. I had stepped outside for only a minute, just to breathe, or pretend to breathe, after amputating my third arm of the day. My uniform was still stained with someone else's blood, and my shoes stuck to the floor with every step. That's when I saw that silhouette in the shadows. It wasn't exactly a man, nor exactly a wounded man. It looked more like a pile of bones wrapped in a dirty blanket. The chair he was lying in was on wheels, but one of the side supports was missing, making his body sway to the side, as if he were falling out of himself. His head lolled forward, but there was a slight, almost imperceptible movement in his fingers. I stood still, unsure of what to do. So many had come and gone without names, without stories, without anyone to remember. But there was something there, in that body discarded off the care route, that pulled me. I approached slowly, more by instinct than reason. I already knew I shouldn't touch. He knew there was a clear order. If it's not on the list, it doesn't exist. It was the phrase doctors repeated without batting an eye. But I'd always had trouble with silent rules. My grandfather used to say my soul was like my grandmother's, restless as water in a crooked bowl. I bent down and touched his wrist, cold, but alive. His breathing was shallow, almost non-existent. The wound in his neck was deep, and the blood had dried in crusts over pale, almost gray skin. He was covered in dust, and something that felt like dirt. I don't know why, but I knelt there. It was then that I heard it. A sound that wasn't a sigh, nor a word, nor a groan. It was something in between. A sound that only made sense after a second, when I realized it was a sentence. 4 words. Almost voiceless, just a drawn-out whisper. But it reached me as if it had been shouted from within my soul. I saw the note. I froze. There was no chance it was a coincidence. There was no way anyone in that war, in that country, in that place, could have known this. My knees buckled, and I had to hold on to the edge of my chair. The man didn't open his eyes. He didn't move again. But I felt it. It felt as if time had ripped from within, and a piece of me, hidden since before the war, had been pulled out by a stranger's voice. A wounded man not on the list. A missing man who found me unseen. I should have run. I should have called the doctor. But I stayed there, sitting on the cold floor, staring at him like someone looking into a dusty mirror, and recognizing a face they swore to forget. The next morning, as if trying to dispel a strange dream, I mentioned the man to the lieutenant in charge of supplies. I called him the one with the broken chair, because that was all I had. No file, no name, nothing to write in the logbook. The lieutenant didn't even look up from the paper. He just slowly chewed a piece of stale bread, and between bites, said in a voice colder than the cement floor, "If he's not on the list, he's not ours." And he went back to writing. The sentence struck me. That was how decisions were made, between crumbs and papers, between lists that decided who deserved to live. I thanked him and left. My feet ached, but it was another part of me that throbbed. Something I couldn't yet name, but which I now understand as deep-seated indignation. I grew up learning that one must respect order, follow one's duty. But I also grew up hearing my mother say that there are silences that scream. And that man, that wounded man, screamed with his whole body. Even unconscious, he spoke louder than all the others, screaming in pain in the hallways. I returned to the backyard late in the afternoon, pretending to get a tray. He was there, just the same, but now with his head tilted to the side, and his lips a little paler. I touched his forehead. Fever. High. The kind of heat that starts to consume you from within. Still nameless, still without a history. But present. So present that my heart raced as if I'd returned to my 17th year, when I still believed the truth could be hidden forever. I tried to convince him, right then and there, in a low voice. "You don't know what you're talking about. That note no longer exists." But he didn't respond. He just breathed heavily, with that sound of crumpled paper being dragged. I returned to the infirmary and walked between the beds as if nothing had happened. I gave morphine to a soldier who was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I changed the bandages of a young man who was crying out for his mother. I sewed a leg back to life even though I knew its owner would never walk again. On the outside, it was just another day at war. On the inside, I was screaming. Screaming because there was a man who knew my secret. The one I had kept for over 40 years, as if it had been buried along with my youth. And now, that secret was rising from the earth, bleeding, feverish, and thrown into an old chair behind the hospital. His silence was what frightened me most. It wasn't the silence of pain. It was the silence of someone who knows, of someone who has seen, of someone who carries something no one else could, a memory that wasn't his, but that he carried as if it were. I wondered, could it have been just delusion that he had guessed? Or, and this was the question that tore at me inside, had someone told him? Someone followed me? But there was no one. I'd known for decades. That note had been burned, and even if someone had found the ashes, no one could have read what was written there. No one. And yet, he knew. He knew as I knew that war doesn't end when the gunfire stops. It lives on inside us like a constant whisper, like the one he gave me. In war, I learned that some names never get written, and that some wounded disappear without leaving a trace, not by chance, but because the world is not prepared for the kind of pain they bring. On the third night, I returned to the courtyard, as if returning to a forbidden place. The hallway was dark, and the ceiling dripped water from a leaky pipe no one had fixed. The early morning chill made my hands ache, but the heat rising in my chest was different. It was the old fear, the fear of being discovered, of having what I'd hidden for 40 years spat back into the world like a living plague. He was there, still there, pale, dirty, and now with his eyes half closed, as if he were merely resting. There was something in his eyes that made me pause. It wasn't the pain. It was the familiarity. As if I'd looked at that face before. Not with those eyes now, but with those of an Althea who no longer exists. I knelt slowly. I'm in the habit of speaking to patients even when they don't respond. I've always done so. But with him, my words came out as if I were confessing. You can't know this. This is in the past. The smell of the soaked cloth on his wound mingled with the smell of dried blood. And even with the wind biting at the back of my throat, I heard it. Again. I saw the note. Only this time, he added a word. I saw the note. All of it. It was like being slapped by my own memory. I fell to the floor, sitting on the floor, and for a moment I felt the war disappear around me. The gunshots, the screams, the smell of ether. Everything vanished. I was back in my mother's kitchen in Missouri. I was 18, my hands trembling, and my heart was breaking. I wrote that note with a pen borrowed from my sister, sitting behind the closet so no one could see. It was more of a rant than a confession, but it said things that couldn't be read. About someone. About a mistake. About a choice I could never take back. And when I finished writing, I folded the paper 4 times, pushed it behind the closet, and promised never to think about it again. Never again. And now, in that forgotten courtyard of war, a nameless man told me that he had read what was buried with me alive. I spent the night there. I carried hidden morphine, clean gauze, and some sugar water in a hidden canteen. He said nothing more. He just looked at me with those dull eyes and, every now and then, moved his fingers as if flipping through an invisible page. I sewed his skin like someone trying to sew together a broken time. My hands trembled, not because of the difficulty of the stitch, but because I felt that, with each needle prick, the secret came back to life. And I started to wonder, what if he wasn't delirious? What if that wounded man had not come to be saved, but to return what I tried to forget? The question haunted me. Who was he? A survivor who recognized me? A deserter who had passed me by before? Or something worse? Someone who should no longer exist? Then everything around us went dark for a moment. The light bulb above us, one of the few still working, popped with a sharp crack. The glass fell near my foot, and I instinctively shielded my face. But he smiled. It was the first smile I'd seen in days, and it wasn't a smile of relief, nor of pain. It was the smile of someone who finally knows they've been found. The next morning, as I tried to write in the registry book, the one where we wrote down each patient's names, dates, and diagnoses, my hand froze. I held the pen still, as if it itself refused the task, because there was no name, no diagnosis, no date. The injured man in the broken chair remained outside of official reality. What existed of him lived only within me, in my eyes, in my hands, in the dread that now followed me like a shadow with its own breath. I had cleaned him, treated him, spoken to him, but I couldn't tell anyone. It was as if that man were a living secret, a secret that now breathed in the same breath as my guilt. In the ward, daily life continued with its painful choreography. Muffled moans, feigned groans, sincere screams. Nurses paced back and forth with basins and bottles of ether. Doctors discussed amputations without looking each other in the eye. But I carried another war within me, a minefield of memories that until then had remained buried, until he whispered. I returned to the courtyard that night as if returning to an altar. He was no longer in the chair. For a second, my heart skipped a beat. My eyes searched the dim courtyard, the shadowy corners, until I found him, now lying on a makeshift stretcher covered with a thin, stained sheet. Someone had moved the body, but there was no record, no note, nothing. It was as if the hospital didn't want to acknowledge his existence, but didn't dare discard him either. I moved closer. His face was a little clearer, and with the moonlight streaming through the cracked window, I could see more clearly. What I saw stopped me inside. There was a scar under his chin, a small crooked line, almost imperceptible, but one I recognized instantly. It was the same scar I'd seen on another face many years before, when I was still a girl hiding behind the school well, running from a boy who swore he loved me with his hands. The scar was his, from a boy who disappeared, from a name never spoken again, from a story ripped from my throat and turned into silence. But it couldn't be. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be here. Not after everything. Not after the note. I sat beside him, unsure whether to cry or run. And then, as if my confusion were fuel, he opened his eyes for a moment. Just for a moment. And in that brief contact, I saw something I can't explain. It was as if he saw me from within. Not as a nurse, not as a woman, but as the one who wrote what should never have been written. The one who betrayed. The one who chose to remain silent. I said, almost in a whisper, "You can't be him." He didn't answer, but he smiled. And once again the silence made a sound. The sound of time returning, carrying what we thought was forgotten. The sound of shame, of doubt, of the question we never dared to answer. What if? From that moment on, everything in me began to move differently. The light sheet draped over him felt heavier than any amputation I'd ever helped care for. It was as if that body carried not just a man, but the sum total of everything I'd tried to hide from myself. A secret that breathed, a past that pulsed, and a name I'd never dared say aloud, but which now threatened to escape, with the help of a missing injured which nobody wanted but which there was found me. In nursing school, we were taught to make quick decisions. Bleeding, pressure, open fracture, immobilize, infection, isolate. But no one taught us what to do when the bleeding isn't visible. No one prepared us to deal with a man who knew our soul, or to face a past that awakens in a feverish body. That kind of decision didn't fit into the protocols. The next night, I waited until the curfew bell rang. The other nurses had already retired. Some were reading Valentines, Others were praying quietly in the dark. I put on my uniform over my nightgown, wrapped the gauze in a dish towel, hid 2 vials of morphine in the folds of my coat, and carried a low battery flashlight. I walked through the empty kitchen past the laundry shed and back to the courtyard. It was colder than usual. A wind from the sea beat against the broken windows, making the convent's cracked stained glass windows sing a piercing lament, as if the saints were complaining about what I was about to do. He was still there, inert, but his skin was clammy and hot with fever. Sweat trickled down his temple and onto the sheet, an old unlabeled fabric that reminded me of the cloths we used to cover bodies that weren't coming home. But he was still breathing, and I couldn't leave him. Not after that. Not after hearing those words that had kept me awake at night for 4 decades. I no longer knew if what held me to him was guilt, compassion, or some strange kind of mirror. But he knew one thing. I couldn't let him die. There, in that forgotten wing of the hospital, I improvised a hiding place, an old screen, 2 laundry carts, and a dark top were enough to create a corner invisible to the hurried eyes of the younger soldiers and nurses. The place where I treated him came to be called, only in my head, the neutral zone. It was like a world apart, where time stood still, where no one asked questions, where secrets could breathe a little before being buried again. I cleaned the wound carefully. The previous stitches were loose, and I redid each one with a suture needle I'd picked up without noticing. As I stitched, I noticed my body trembling, but not from fear. It was the kind of trembling that comes when you're doing something forbidden, and yet you know it's right. Or maybe just the inevitable. The blood was seeping slowly, and I used folded cloths, as if cleaning a stain on myself. For the first time, I spoke to him out loud. Not with the clinical language of nurses, but like someone who's forgotten how to live. "Do you know me?" I asked. He didn't answer, but he opened one eye, and in that eye, there was a color I remembered. Not the color of the iris, but the color of pain. The same one I saw when I wrote that note. The same one I felt when I pretended to sleep so I wouldn't think about him. At that moment, something changed. The trained, disciplined nurse who followed orders without question. She stood outside the neutral zone. The one who remained inside was me. Only me. With the stained sheet, the smell of the past returning, and a wound that unearthed me with every breath. In war, we learn to follow orders. But in that moment, I learned that there are pains that demand disobedience, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to hide those who should be forgotten, just so that we ourselves don't disappear. The sheet covering his body wasn't like the others. It didn't have the embroidered battalion tag, nor the laundry identification number, nor even the reinforced stitching we used for serious cases. It was an old stained sheet, made of rough fabric, a little smaller than hospital standards. So ordinary it might have gone unnoticed. But there was something there, a detail, a hand-sewn tear on the side with dark thread, a crooked, poorly done stitching I knew. It was my sewing. I stared for several minutes, as if it were a mirage. In 1941, during my 2nd month on the ward, a patient had ripped an entire sheet during a fever. Supplies were running low, and the supervisor ordered it discarded. But I took the fabric back to the dormitory and sewed it back together by hand with black thread borrowed from the cook. It was my way of not letting anything go to waste, of preserving something. I thought the sheet had gone with the next wave of patients. But there it was, years later, on the body of a man who shouldn't exist. I touched the stitching with my fingertips. It was fraying. The most recent blood had stained that very spot. The black thread was now tinged a dark brown, almost rust. I wanted to cry. Not for him. Not for myself. But for something deeper. As if time had folded silently just to give me back this, not the sheet itself, but the gesture sewn into it. That night I carefully removed the sheet, folded it into 4 pieces, and tucked it away in my closet, between my spare apron and a photo of my mother smiling with her arms crossed. I couldn't explain why. It was just fabric. But at the same time, it wasn't just that. It was a reminder that I had already tried to mend what was broken, and that now, decades later, injured person who was not on the list returned covered by that same gesture. With it came questions I didn't know how to ask. Who brought that sheet back? How did it end up with that man? Was it a coincidence? Or was it another warning whispered by the war itself? I kept these questions on my lips, but I never said them out loud, because part of me was afraid of the answer, and another part already knew. The following nights were all the same. I'd sneak in, turn on only my handheld flashlight, warm a cloth in warm water, and clean the wounds that refused to heal. And whenever he fell asleep, I'd sit with the blanket on my lap. Sometimes I'd run my fingers along the seam, as if it were a scar. Other times I'd press the fabric to my face, searching for a smell, a memory, anything that would tell me this was really happening. And the strangest thing is that I felt less alone there. Even amidst the groans of the other wounded, the hurried footsteps of the soldiers in the hallway, and the creaking of the windows as the wind blew, it was in that forgotten corner, next to that missing, that I felt something akin to companionship. Maybe because he too was patched together. Maybe because we were both pieces of things that time had tried to throw away. But that, somehow, were still here. And in that silence where names are lost, only the gesture remained. And the sheet, nameless, numberless, but full of what was never said. Blood has a smell, and it's not just iron, as they say in the books. It's a smell that changes, depending on the person, the pain, the time. I thought I knew all the different types. The blood of screaming boys with bullets in their shoulders, the silent men with their legs torn apart, the congealed blood of those who had already given up fighting. But that man's blood had a scent that carried me. Not to the battlefield, but to the backyard of my childhood. It was a warm, sweet smell, with a damp clay-like note after the rain. Almost imperceptible, but real. I smelled it the 3rd morning I treated him. I was changing the dressings on his shoulder wound, and as I pulled back the gauze, the air around me seemed to shift. For a moment, I was no longer in the hospital, but in my mother's backyard in Missouri. I remembered the cement tank where she washed clothes, the fallen fig leaves on the ground, and the smell of wet earth rising from the roots when I played barefoot. It was the same smell. The same. Which made no sense at all. Inside, I trembled, not out of fear, but because that scent pulled me back to a memory I'd spent years trying to erase. The afternoon my world spun for the first time. I was 17. I was sitting under the fig tree with my school notebook on my lap. He approached without warning. He wore his technical school uniform. He smiled as if nothing in the world could touch him. And then he called me by name. My full name. No one called me that. Only him. The same name the wounded man had murmured the night before, between fevers. Althea Jean. A name spoken with tenderness and something more, as if calling me back. I remembered how he'd chased me when I'd fled. I remembered the fight in the kitchen, the blood dripping from a cut on his chin, the same cut that was now healing on the face of the man without a criminal record. I began to wonder, what if it had been him? But the math didn't add up. The time didn't add up. He must have been older, or younger. I couldn't tell anymore. Faces change. Memory betrays us. But that smell, That smell was impossible to invent. I spent the night there, beside him, with the blanket on my lap and my head in my hands. I began to wonder if what I was experiencing was real, if he was truly a wounded man, or just a mirage from my past, crying out for healing. The nurses said I was distracted. One asked me if I was getting enough sleep. Another said it was normal to feel a little strange after so much time on the job. But what I felt wasn't exhaustion. It was recognition. I started avoiding others, inventing tasks just to spend more time with him. Sometimes I sat in silence and watched his breathing. Sometimes I talked to myself. Or to him, I'm not sure anymore. I told him things I'd never told anyone. About the blue dress I never wore. The letter my mother burned without telling me. The name I'd considered giving the son I never had. And he listened. Even unconscious, even motionless, he listened. Because his fingers moved. Because his eyes twitched. Because there was something in him that said, I remember too. And when silence fell again, I could still smell the damp earth. The smell of the beginning of everything. The smell of guilt returning dressed as a survivor. It was like speaking to a mirror that reflected not an image, but memory. Over the next few nights as I tended to him in the neutral zone behind the old screens, I began to speak. Quietly, hesitantly, as if testing words before letting them exist. I spoke of the cold. I spoke of the smell of burning cotton. I spoke of the letters I'd torn up and the prayers I'd never finished. And he listened. Not with his ears. Those always seemed distant. But with another part. As if his skin absorbed my confessions and silently returned to me what I myself no longer knew how to feel. Until he started talking too. The first time I thought it was delirium. He murmured a string of disjointed words with long pauses and shallow breaths. But there was meaning, and it was a meaning all my own. He said, You were wearing blue. The note had a name, but you cut it. My knees weakened. I leaned against the edge of the gurney, trying to understand how a man with no identity could know about the dress I wore that day. The only day. The same blue cotton dress with a small tear in the hem, where the backyard fence had caught me when I ran. And the note. Yes, I had cut a part of it. I had ripped out the name, so no one would know who he was referring to. And yet, he knew. I remained silent for hours. Time lost its shape. Outside, I heard voices. A soldier coughing, a radio hissing, someone vomiting into a bucket. But there, inside that dark square, where two souls recognized each other without naming each other, the world seemed suspended. I began to tell more. Not by choice, but because my body demanded it. Telling was like breathing. As if everything I'd bottled up for 4 decades, everything I'd swallowed until I'd forgotten the taste, now had a place to fit. I spoke of the decision I made when I found out. I spoke of the choice I made that no one ever understood, because no one knew. I spoke of the guilt that followed me like a shadow sewn across my back, and he, between one fever and another, filled my silences. Not as someone who guessed, but as someone who was there. I began to suspect that perhaps he was an invention of pain itself, a way time created to force me to look at what I never wanted to see. But how could I deny the touch of warm skin, the sound of a heartbeat, the wound slowly closing even without explanation? One of the strangest nights was when he said, "You tried to write again, but your hand wouldn't obey." I stopped. I closed my eyes, and I saw it. I saw the image perfectly. Me, now an adult, now a nurse, sitting in a small rented room in St. Louis, with a blank sheet of paper and a blue pen. I was trying to write a letter of confession to my older sister. My hand was shaking so badly the words came out slurred. In the end, I wrote only 3 lines and tore it all up. I never told anyone about this, not even God. But he knew. At that moment, I realized that I was no longer the one taking care of him. It was he who was taking care of me, as if that wounded man, forgotten by the world, carried the pieces of me I'd left behind along the way. He spoke my truths, as if they were his own, as if he'd lived each one. And maybe he had. Or maybe he was just the echo of myself I'd buried alive. And when he fell asleep, his breathing took with it another piece of my silence. There was a precise spot on the left side of his abdomen that I avoided looking at. I don't know why. It was as if my body knew before my mind that there was something there that shouldn't be seen. But that night, the fever came back stronger. The shoulder wound had healed, but the side of his abdomen was beginning to swell. I had to check it out. There was no excuse anymore. We were alone. The night was muggy, windless, and only the distant sound of a military radio leaking an old song filled the space. I pulled on my gloves, gently lifted his shirt, and then stopped. On the lower abdomen, slightly to the left, I saw a dark, crescent-shaped spot. A birthmark, small, but unmistakable. It was the same one I'd seen when I was 17, hidden beneath the loose elastic of the pants of a boy who swore he loved me while holding my wrists too tightly. That boy. The one who made me write the note. The one who disappeared. The one no one else saw. The one who became silent in my family. And now, there, was the same mark. I exhaled slowly, like someone uttering a forbidden prayer. I looked away as if it were indecent, not because of my body, but because of the memory it brought. I pressed my back against the wall and slid to the floor, my dirty lab coat dragging on the cold cement. I ran my hands over my face, my temples, my eyes. But the image wouldn't go away. The mark was there, as if it had crossed decades just to face me again. My first impulse was to deny it. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The age didn't match. The timing didn't match. I would have recognized him sooner. His voice, the shape of his fingers, the scent of his skin. But the problem was, all of it was there, only different. As if someone had taken the same human being and turned time backward. As if the past had aged prematurely. And then I began to wonder, what if it wasn't him? What if it was his son, or grandson? A blood connection that escaped me and came back, disguised as nameless wounded, to take revenge with silence. It was delirium, I told myself. Delirium caused by trauma, by unresolved grief, by guilt. But deep down, something inside me already knew. That mark was the same. And it shouldn't be there. Not now. Not like this. I spent the rest of the night sitting beside him, not touching him. Just watching his chest rise and fall. Like a grandfather clock, trying to keep time. In my head, voices from the past mingled. My mother's saying, "Be careful what you hide." My childhood pastor's saying, "What is buried will be revealed." And his, from the note, the sentence I wrote and never read aloud. I will never know what would have grown out of me if I had stayed. Now there he was, or part of him, or his echo, with the mark on his body and my name on his lips. I wanted to run, to scream. But all I could do was lean against him and close my eyes. And in the darkness, I felt his arm move slightly, as if enveloping me, or as if asking for forgiveness. That night the war seemed to fall silent for a few moments. I don't know if it was the sea breeze that stopped, or if it was me who stopped listening. The truth is that, for a few minutes, everything retreated within me. There was a strange calm in the air, the kind that precedes a collapse or a miracle. I sat beside him, hands on my knees, feeling my body no longer obey me as it once had. His fever had subsided, but my memory burned. The sheet now covered only half of his body, and the light from the oil lamp left shadows trembling on the cracked walls of the neutral zone. It was then that I realized the hiding place I had built for him had always existed within me. Ever since I wrote that note and hid it behind the kitchen cabinet, I've been harboring what shouldn't be seen. My hands learned to fold bloody cloths, to sew skin, to feign normalcy, but they never stopped keeping. Not just gauze and jars, but memories, sentences, what was and what could have been. And now, decades later, that man occupied not just the darkest corner of the ward, but the most secret corner of me. I began reinforcing the barriers of the hiding place like someone reinforcing a lie that's starting to give way. I added more cloths, pulled out 2 old cabinets to disguise the side entrance. I wrote, "Empty supplies, do not open," on a makeshift sign, and tied it with cotton thread so no one would dare look. I did everything calmly, methodically, like someone organizing their own tomb. And deep down, I felt it wasn't just for him. It was for me. Every misplaced object, every repositioned cart, was an attempt to hold on to what I could no longer keep in memory alone. If someone found him, it wouldn't just be him who would be lost. It would be me. I began to realize how much it hurt to see him there. Not because of the wound nor the fever, but because of what he awakened. It was like looking into a forgotten trunk and finding not only things of your own, but parts of yourself you hadn't remembered burying. There was something about the way he slept, with his face turned slightly to the side, that reminded me of someone. And when I pulled the sheet up to his chin, I felt as if I were covering a past, begging to be remembered. One night I touched her hand with my fingertips. The skin was cold, but there was a pulse, a signal. I leaned in and whispered, "You're safe here." And in that instant, something inside me cringed, because I realized I was the one who needed to hear that. I'd spent my whole life waiting for someone to say it to me, to say, "You can rest easy. I know what you're hiding, and even so, I will care." And that night I understood that the royal hideout, it wasn't behind the screens, nor between the cloths. It was inside me. It was my soul hastily sewn together, my memory lined with silence, my body as a shelter for what no one wanted to see. He was the wounded man who wasn't on the list, and I was the nurse who no longer knew whether to care for him or what he was doing to revive me. No one knew, but I began to reserve part of my shift just for him. My nightly visits became silent rituals, like an intimate mass without a priest or witnesses. After the corridors emptied and the sound of sirens faded, I would wipe my hands with a damp cloth, tie my hair back with 2 worn-out clips, and cross the courtyard, shoes in hand. I didn't make a sound. I didn't cough. I didn't think much. I just went, as if my body knew the way even when my mind hesitated. The convent walls, cracked and covered in damp, seemed to recognize my footsteps. The musty smell was the same as always, but inside, everything changed. He slept almost every day. Other times he just pretended, and I pretended to believe him. I sat near the stretcher, my back to the door, my knees bent and my eyes on the floor, and I talked. I talked like someone writing a letter without an address, just to lighten the load on their hands. I started telling small things. The number of soldiers treated that day, the most common type of wound, the behavior of the new lieutenant who had arrived from Sicily. Then I began to tell stories no one else knew. I told him about the time I lost my first patient. I told him about the time I ran away from school because a girl called me a broken person. I told him about the time my father yelled at me for reading a forbidden book. I told him about what it felt like to see my own blood for the first time. I told him about him, from the other he. I didn't say his name. I never did. But I spoke of the way his eyes smiled, the curve of his left ear, the dimple that appeared when he apologized. I spoke of the way he squeezed my hand after everything had happened, as if that squeeze could undo what he himself had caused. I spoke of the note, of how I wrote it without courage, of how I hid it, not wanting anyone to see, but at the same time deeply wishing someone would. Because sometimes, what we really want is to be discovered, just so we don't have to pretend anymore. And the wounded man, that man with no name, no record, no number, listened. His eyes, even closed, seemed alive. His breathing, though irregular, responded to the rhythm of my words. When I fell silent, he moved. Small gestures, a crooked finger, a deeper sigh, a tremble of the chin, as if to say, "Keep going, I'm here." Little by little, I stopped thinking of him as a patient and began treating him as a confidant, or perhaps as an accomplice, because everything about him seemed made of the same stuff I was made of. The silence, the shame, the secrecy. He was the only place where my truths didn't hurt so much, where guilt didn't strangle me, where the word survivor didn't seem so false. One night I touched his hand and said, "If you're really who I think you are, forgive me." He opened his eyes but didn't answer. He just looked at me, a calm, deep, unpressuring look, as if he already knew, as if he'd always known. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and understood. I didn't need the answer, because deep down, that question wasn't for him. It was for me. It was for the part of me that was hidden with the note behind the closet in 1939. And of all the visits I'd made to that hiding place, this was the first time I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was being cared for too. The fever returned with a vengeance one November dawn. The weather had changed overnight. The warm southern breeze had been swallowed by a freezing, biting wind that made the cracked stained glass windows shudder like bones under stress. I knew what that meant. Sudden fevers at that stage came with delirium, and delirium came with truth. Truths that reason tried to hide, but that the fever ripped away like tender skin. I had seen this before. Soldiers confessing to betrayal, boys calling out for dead mothers, men shouting forbidden names. And now, it was him. When I entered the hideout that night, I noticed it immediately. Sweat drenched his chest. The sheets covering him were damp and tangled. His face, always pale, was now flushed, his eyes blinking unfocused, his lips parted, mumbling broken words. I hurried. I placed cold cloths on his forehead, held his hand, tried to steady his breathing. He was trembling. His skin burned. His fingers clutched the sheets as if he wanted to tear them. I leaned closer, listened, and then I heard it again. The sentence. But this time, he sighed one more word. "I saw the note. Mom." My entire body froze. The words entered my ears and burned in my stomach. Mother. He said mother. It wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just the echo of a buried confession. It was a call. And that call wasn't vague. It was intimate. It was direct. As if there were no more veils between us. As if, in that single feverish moment, he had freed himself from time. And said what perhaps he himself didn't even know he knew. Mother. I backed away, tripping over my own body. I leaned against the wall, feeling my heart pound as if it wanted to escape me. I took several deep breaths, but the air wouldn't come. What did he mean? Was it possible? No, it wasn't. I didn't have children, at least, not officially, not biologically, not that anyone would know. But there was that week in 1940, that absence of cycles, that doctor who smiled crookedly and said that sometimes the scare is just a scare. I never went back there, never confirmed it, never accepted it. I just pretended it passed. I pretended so well that even I believed it. But what if it hadn't passed? I looked at him again, and everything about him seemed to say otherwise. The birthmark, the color of his eyes, the way my name rolled off his tongue, as if it had been taught to him forever. And now, that Mom. Not as an insult, nor as a delusion, but as someone seeking shelter, as someone finally returning home. I moved closer again. I placed my hand on his forehead. He was panting, but less heavily. His eyes opened for a second. They looked at me, and for the first time I saw no judgment, no pain. I saw belonging. I whispered, "What did you call me?" He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes again. But a faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. And in that gesture I understood he didn't need to repeat himself. The word had already been said, and she had gone through me like a scalpel, through raw flesh. In the following days the fever subsided, but something inside me remained burning. It wasn't physical. It was deeper, quieter. A fever that doesn't make you sweat, but makes you dream. And I dreamed. I daydreamed of a child's voice calling me back. I dreamed of laughter I'd never heard, but which hurt like a memory. And every time I looked at him, I saw less of a wounded man, and more of a clouded mirror of something that almost was. One cloudy afternoon, while changing the bandages on his chest, he spoke again. His voice was still low, scratchy from effort and time, but clear enough to stop me in mid-sentence. "Althea!" It wasn't Althea, as everyone always called me. It was Althea, a twisted, almost poetic variation, spoken as if conjuring a memory. It pierced me more than any scalpel. I froze, my hand clutching the gauze strip, my gaze fixed on nothing. He repeated, "Althea. My mother called me that, before she disappeared." The world collapsed with a dull crack. I never told anyone, but as a child my mother sometimes called me that, jokingly. She said it was my old name, when I was still just a tiny piece of soul in God's arms. It was her way of soothing me when I cried in the dark, and I hated it. I hated it because it sounded strange, because it felt like I was someone else. When I grew up, I asked her to stop, and she did. But I remembered. God knows I remembered. He couldn't have known that. Nobody could. "And yet," he said. He said, looking at me as if looking back to his origins. There was no doubt in that look, no arrogance, just belonging. A calmness of someone who's rediscovered something that never had a name. I sat beside the bed and remained there, wordless. I touched my throat as if hoping for some explanation, some certainty to emerge. But there was only the emptiness pulsing between my ribs. Was it possible that it was the result of something I had done? Of a mistake? Of a silence that had become flesh? I began to mentally revisit the lost months of my youth. The missed bleedings, the nausea I denied, the seamstress who gave me a sideways look when she measured my waist in August, my mother's words when she sent me to my aunt's house without asking why. "It's just to rest, Althea." That's what she said. And now, decades later, a man with no past, no record, no name, gave me back that word like a key. Not a metal key, but a sound. A name I'd never heard outside of childhood, but mine. Really mine. Mine from before. I began to cry. Silently. The kind of crying that doesn't wet your face but chokes your stomach. And when I took a deep breath, I felt something new. An old guilt wanting to turn into forgiveness. A forgiveness that perhaps I had never sought. But that found me now, in the form of a voice, in the form of a name, in the form of a missing that perhaps was born from my own silence. It was on a low morning when the convent bells rang out of turn that everything changed. I was changing the sheets of an amputee in the north wing when one of the captains came in shouting orders. Immediate evacuation. An enemy convoy had breached the barrier to the west and was approaching too fast. We had only a few hours to dismount what was possible, save those who could still walk, and abandon the rest. The rest. That's what he said. The rest. My hands froze. The gurney I was on stopped in the middle of the hallway. My eyes darted around the ward, but my mind was elsewhere. Back there. In the back. In the hiding place. In him. The soldiers began stacking boxes. The doctors shouted names. The nurses scurried like panicked ants. I was pushed by one of them, who said to me, "You need to organize your patients. Let's leave the most critical ones behind." And all I could think was, he's not on any file. He has no number. He's the kind of wounded man who will be forgotten even before the last stretcher is rolled out. I pretended to be busy. I wrote names on old labels. I folded lab coats. But with each passing minute, the sound of the trucks being packed sounded like a death knell. I ran to the hiding place as soon as no one was looking. I entered through the side, pushed the cabinet hard, and there he was, pale but conscious. He looked at me as if he already knew, as if you'd been waiting for me, as if to say, "The time has come." I knelt, trembling. "We have to go. They'll leave everything behind. They'll forget you." My voice was broken, as if my throat were full of shards. And he, with absurd calm, simply said, "I know." It was as if he accepted the oblivion, as if it belonged to him. I tried to think quickly. Carry him? Impossible. I was too thin. He was too weak. Put him with the others? They would ask who he was, where the file was, why they'd never seen him. The risk was enormous. And more than that, if he really was who I feared, if he had been born from what I'd hidden, then his revelation would bring to light everything I'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. My youth, my shame, my mistake, my abandonment. I stared at him, his sweaty face, his calm gaze, like someone forgiving before judgment, and I asked myself, what hurts more, losing him or revealing him? I grabbed one of the vials of morphine and a syringe. I injected the minimum dose, just enough to make him sleep, so he wouldn't feel it. I kissed his forehead. "Forgive me," I whispered, but it was meant for me. The pain in my bones was breathless, because in that moment, I understood that I, too, would be left behind. I sealed the entrance to the hideout with boxes and dirty rags. I wrote, "Infected," in large letters on a wet piece of paper and taped it to the front. No one would open it. No one would search. War taught us to avoid what we fear. And I climbed onto the last truck with my hands covered in blood and silence. As the engine roared, I looked back. I saw the convent disappear into the horizon. I saw the tower disappear into the dust. And I knew that in that place, I had left more than just a man, but everything I was. I returned to Naples many years later. I was a different woman, with a different name, embroidered on the pocket of my lab coat, and a cane instead of a cane. I volunteered for a Red Cross registration program. They wanted to map the abandoned war sites, catalog names, and record absences. I only accepted for a reason I haven't confessed to anyone. I wanted to know if he was still there. The convent still stood, though the corridors had become overgrown. The chapel's stained glass window had been blown out by some explosion, and the altar was now nothing but stone dust and rubble. I walked slowly, guided by the sound of memory, the sound of my footsteps from before. When I reached the end of the courtyard, I found the wall of the hiding place covered in ivy. There was still a piece of wood leaning against where the entrance had been. I knew where to pull. My fingers, though trembling, still remembered the exact spot. I pushed the cabinet open with effort. The air that came out was heavy, stuffy, but not putrid. There was no body. There was no sign of death. Just a strange, tidy emptiness. The stretcher was still there, but folded neatly, as if it had never been used. The cloths had been stacked, and on the corner of the crumbling foam mattress lay a folded piece of paper. I stopped. There was no wind, but I felt cold. I walked over, my legs trembling, in a way no illness had ever caused before. I picked up the paper. It was folded exactly the way I folded my notes. 4 ways. The center fold slightly angled. When I opened it, I saw the handwriting. It was mine. My handwriting. It didn't seem like it. It was. But I never wrote that. You left something in me. Now I leave something in you. The ink was aged, but intact. There was no signature. There was no date, but there was certainty, and a pain that had no name. I sat on the ground, on the roots sprouting between the stones, the note between my fingers, as if holding the last piece of a puzzle I never asked to put together. Then I remembered something I'd buried deeper than the secret itself. The night I left, I'd written a second note, one I never delivered, one I'd kept in my apron pocket and which disappeared mid-evacuation. I wrote as if bleeding. It said, "If you're real, one day you'll return." But that piece of paper was never found. Or was it? Maybe it was read by him. Maybe it was answered. Or maybe it never existed. All I know is that the man disappeared. The nameless, wounded man. The survivor of silence. There was no entry record, no body, no file, no headstone. Just an empty hiding place. And a letter in my handwriting that I didn't remember writing. And in that void, where I thought I would find his death, I found something else. The absence that became full. Because there was something in that place, in that paper, in that gesture, that said he lived. Even if it was just to remind me that silence also breathes. Today, sitting in this worn chair next to the dusty piano, with the dried flowers in the vase and the calendar frozen for decades, I still keep the sheet. It's folded in 4 inside the blue cardboard box at the back of my closet, among the letters I never sent and the keys to doors that no longer exist. Sometimes, when the pain in my leg wakes me before the sun, I take it out just to feel its weight. It doesn't weigh much, but it weighs where it matters. The crooked stitching is still there. Unraveled in some spots. The black thread has become a thin thread, almost unraveling. But it still holds. Like me. Like him. Like everything we can't explain. We can only feel. For a long time, I thought it was all a fabrication of guilt. An emotional fever that made me see in a stranger's face the past I'd buried. But the paper is still with me. And the handwriting is mine. Even if I never remember writing those words. You left something in me. Now I leave something in you. He did leave something. He left something that no one sees. Not the doctors, not the priests, not the grandchildren of the other elderly people who come to visit on Sundays. Something that breathes within me to this day. A kind of wound that doesn't hurt, but pulsates. I didn't ask for them to believe. I never did. And yet, there are days when I look out the window and imagine that one, somewhere in the world, is living with a part of me in their chest. A part I denied, that I abandoned, that I hid even from God. And as much as I was trained to follow protocols, to leave behind unregistered bodies to harden in the face of pain, there was one day, one single day, when a Tound almost let a man die. I was going, really. I got up to go. I was already 2 steps from the door. But then he whispered, "I saw the note." In that moment, everything came back. The smell of rain in the yard, the old name, the unanswered question, the crooked seam, the blood on the kitchen doorknob. Everything I thought was gone. Whispered back. And so I stayed. Today I understand. He didn't whisper to accuse me. He whispered to give me back, to remind me of who I was before the war, before the silence, before the guilt became a habit. If this story has reached you, I'm not asking for judgment. Just listen. If this story touched you, please comment where you're listening from, and subscribe to the channel to continue following untold stories of the war. And tell me, what would you have done? They told me to ignore the injured person, but he whispered what made me alive.